Good evening. I'm Mark Harris. Welcome to the DiversiTV Season 7. Wow, we've been doing this for 7 seasons. Our seasons roughly correspond to LCC terms, so we've been doing this for a little over 3 years. If you are new to DiversiTV, this is a weekly interview show that's not attached to a class yet, but will probably be offered for credit sometime in the near future. And it's a weekly interview show where I interview a guest one-on-one along the rough rubric of diversity, and we try to stretch the limits of what that means. But generally speaking, we use the LCC organizational definition, which includes race, gender, ethnicity, social class, age, ability, or whatever else we can think of. So tonight, when we talk about having a Native nation or indigenous perspective, I'm gonna explain how we're stretching that with our guest tonight. So if you're new to DiversiTV, welcome, and if you're part of our growing legion of fans and viewers, welcome back. To explain our mission, DiversiTV's mission, roughly speaking, is to illuminate everyday diversity issues and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. So we're performing a little bit of media advocacy here, and basically using the medium of television to kind of be educational. So I'm not going to really go into our schedule because this is the first season, but we usually start with a Native perspective and then continue on. Since we're speaking English, the second season is usually Anglo. Second show is usually Anglo, then African American, then Latino, then Asian, then etc. Then we'll do gay, lesbian, bisexual. We'll do class. It depends on the availability of guests. So the idea, when I basically talk about a Native perspective, if you could go to slide again. The name of the continent that we're riding on, that one of the traditional indigenous names, just like in Africa, Africa isn't actually the indigenous name for that continent, that's the Greek name for that continent, means the same thing. Africa means land of the blacks, Alkebulan means land of the blacks. In Africa, this continent that we're sitting on now was referred to as Atl Anta, which means water and metal. It also was called the circuit of the world, meaning the only continent which stretches from pole to pole unbroken. So the only way that you could know that is if you had actually sailed it. So there was trade with Africa and what was referred to by the indigenous Native people as either Tulapit Wapakisinep, which translates as the long-reaching land, also known as Turtle Island. Now, if you see the graphic here, Turtle Island, even though traditionally, depending on, as I was talking about with my guests, when she was under the impression, as many people are, that Turtle Island only meant North America down to the Panama Canal, and I pointed out, well, wait a minute, there weren't no Panama Canal before, 200 years ago. There weren't no borders 200 years ago. The concept of Turtle Island is from Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip of what is now called South America, to the Arctic Circle. One land, many nations, no borders. So you had people, indigenous people, like for example, the people that the Spanish referred to as the Tierra del Fuegans, who didn't have fire, but could live naked in the snow. You had pyramid cities, like in Mexico, and you also had pueblo dwellings and all people with trade routes and things like that. So an indigenous or native perspective from the traditional view of Turtle Island would include where our guest is from tonight, which is traditionally South America, but that has also been matter of contention because, who is indigenous, who is not, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk about that. So our guest tonight is Mara Ventura. She is a campus organizer with the Oregon Student Association and works around issues of educational and tuition equity. Welcome.
Thank you.
So where are you from?
Well, I was born in Bogota, Colombia, but I was adopted out of an orphanage, so my roots beyond that are kind of a mystery at this point.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yep.
So before we were talking this afternoon about what your adopted parents did and how you got here.
Yeah.
The United States, and I'll ask about how you got to Eugene later, but.
Okay. Well, I was adopted when I was 2 months old.
Okay.
So at the time, my parents were living right outside of D.C., and my father was working in the Department of the Interior for both of Reagan's terms and Bush's terms. And then obviously left after Clinton came into office. So we headed west after that.
Go west, Venturas.
Yes.
Department of the Interior, what was he doing? Because that could entail a lot of different things, like with natives, among other things. But
yes, actually, that sparked a lot of heated debate between my father and I because he worked with the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Wow, okay.
I didn't know very much about the BIA until I started taking more Native Studies classes in school. So when I first started to really understand contemporary Native issues in the U.S. and having discussions with him, I didn't realize that his only real experience with any Native people or sovereign nations or tribal governments, et cetera, was with the BIA. So his experiences were really negative in terms of some of the things that were happening during Reagan's eras and Bush's eras with money. And that's, for those who don't know, the Department of the Interior does the federal budget. So, I mean, my father was basically working on that. I don't know specifically what he was doing, but I mean, like what his jobs were. But so there was a lot of heated debate because I didn't understand why he thought such negative things about the, Native peoples or Native issues or so forth. So.
Well, it could have been sort of like a mimetic infection from the agency itself.
Right.
And what I mean by that is kind of like a virus of the mind, because the BIA was the War Department with respect to Indian nations. We were at war with them, and then we won, right? And then so they create the BIA to administer all kinds of things. And so in terms of the negative vibe, not only towards Native people, but in terms of upholding your relationship in terms of land rights, mineral rights, oil royalties, and stuff like that. The policies of the War Department definitely were continued on, and we can't just lay the blame on Republicans, really. But yeah, definitely some of that would be kind of hostile under Reagan and Bush, and somewhat under Clinton too, and definitely some of the things that we've seen with Bush too. And so we'll see what happens under our current president with that.
We will. I watched for his platform. They got a section on his website, but I don't know what serious steps he's taken towards that yet.
There's a lot of controversy within Indian country around Obama because of his association with the Congressional Black Caucus and some of the positions that CBC has taken towards Cherokee and its relationship with its Black Indian population and whether they're citizens or not, etc. So yeah. So how'd you come to Eugene?
Well, in between moving out of DC and high school, I did a lot of other sort of moving around just because my parents switched jobs a lot. It was just kind of like, let's just try other places. But I was a senior in high school, and I didn't really get into the schools I wanted to in California, and the schools I did, I just wasn't thrilled about. And so I picked 2 schools out of state. I picked CU Boulder, and I picked the University of Oregon. And everyone said they're the same. They're
in
big,
some ways, right? I guess.
They're big, they're liberal, they're blah, 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 blah. So very outdoorsy schools. You know, one sits on the Rockies, one sits on the coast. So I remember not being able to choose, and I did orientations at both, and my dad said, pick rain or snow. So I said snow. So I actually headed to Colorado for my first year of college. And that was an experience.
Rain or snow. So, yeah, what happened there?
The racism there is very overt and in your face. They have no shame. So I wasn't used to that.
In liberal Boulder.
Yes. So I wasn't used to that. I had never seen people act so outwardly hateful towards people because of the color of their skin or.
And you came from D.C.
Yeah, but I was only there till I was like 7 or 8, so
Okay.
it wasn't anything that and all the school systems I was in, they were all predominantly white institutions. So I just wasn't used to seeing it. I grew up in this very everyone's equal mindset.
Yeah.
Or if racism exists, it's just old folks somewhere in the mountains. You know, I just
right.
had this idea that
Out in the country.
right,
Yeah.
exactly, sitting in their rocking chair somewhere. So I had a large dose of reality at that school, and considering how much money I took out in loans to be there, it just didn't seem worth it. I think I was good that I went because it sparked a lot of my passions and really.
Did you declare a major when you were there?
I didn't. I wanted to do photography, but again, going into sort of how much money and energy my parents were putting in for me to be there, my parents were really hesitant about me doing that, so I ended up doing undeclared for a year. And then right before I left Boulder, I took a sociology class called Social Inequalities, which any Soc major is familiar with.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I got involved with a lot of different campaigns. I helped run the 2004 elections and worked with hunger and homelessness, and I found MECHA, et cetera. So, I mean, it was good that I went.
Explain what MECHA is for our viewers that don't know what that is.
Okay. MECHA stands for Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, which basically just means Chicano Student Movement.
Okay.
And it's a national organization that started in the early 60s, but the name wasn't officially adopted nationally until 1969 at a conference in California. And the students have founding documents, which I think they don't necessarily live by word for word, but I think sometimes gets MECHA in trouble because they were from the 60s, they were products of the 60s. They were very radical, the language was radical, the demands were radical, the things that the people...
What's so radical? As I don't know if you've met my daughter, but one of the things her famous quotes that I use, it's a thin line between radical and common sense.
I agree, I like that. Smart daughter. I don't particularly like the word radical on a personal level because I would agree with your daughter. I don't think there's anything radical than wanting the world to be a better place. But that's just, at the time, I mean, that's what our planets are seen as very radical in terms of, so for instance, the planets use words like gringo or like the bronze people, which to us are used a little more loosely now. I guess I would use the word fluid. We understand language as fluid and able to sort of take words and put a different kind of power behind them, power not to oppress, but a power to empower. That doesn't really make sense, but...
Well, empower could mean power within rather than power over.
Right.
As in one of the contexts you could think of with English. Dominating power, power over, instead of empower, power within.
Right. It's kind of like how Bell Hooks, she talks about power in terms of her only experience with power had been the suffering that she had seen of other people using power over people in her own community. And it wasn't until she got older that she realized that power can be a good thing. It just depends on what you do with it.
Yeah. It's more of like it's a capacity, not so much an object. So
Right.
do you use it or not? So, yeah, in the context that we were talking about in terms of what radical was, I was attempting to explain the radical Republicans. Lincoln was a moderate. So Lincoln's solution to slavery, for example, was, okay, all you black people need to go to Costa Rica, which, okay, how do you move 4 million people to Costa Rica when you don't have the ships, the railroads? I mean, Costa Rica has got nice surfing, but wait a minute. 4 million, free and enslaved black people, you're going to free them and send them to Costa Rica?
I mean, and let alone that you've already displaced them out of their own country.
Let alone, right, yeah. So, it took a general, to explain to them that, look, if you took all the ships in the Navy, put all the black people that could fit on all the ships in the Navy, you wouldn't be everybody. By the time you got them, because there weren't no Panama Canal then, by the time you got them from the East Coast around South America to Costa Rica, actually that wouldn't happen, around Florida to Costa Rica, then the ones that had left would basically repopulate the ones you took. So that was the moderate response, right? Because he called Frederick Douglass in to have them do that. Then the other piece, the radical Republicans, Stevens and Sumner, basically said, okay, the only solution to slavery is to free the slaves, give them an education, give them the vote, give them 40 acres and a mule. In other words, make them free and equal to white people.
Right.
That was considered radical. Equality was radical. And so that's what prompted her comment. Thin line between radical and common sense, well, of course they're equal. So, in the context of when we'll get into educational equity, all right, the idea of Turtle Island, no borders. Everybody has equal access to whatever educational system exists, because if you can build pyramid cities in Mexico, you need an educational system to do that. And the Incas, whatever else is going on in Colombia indigenously, right? You got pyramid cities or stone cities in the Andes there as well. So what kind of access to education would that be? So when the radical things that the Mechistas were talking about that scare some folks is like having the proposal of a brown homeland in all the states that have Spanish names. Like, well, no. While we would like U.S. out of North America, that ain't going to happen. So what are some of the radical things?
Well, I think another thing is that, and I'm glad that you actually brought that up in terms of like what people don't know, or I just think that sometimes claiming those things, oftentimes people see it as unpatriotic or un-American, or this ridiculous myth that we want to give our land back to Mexico. So I think that it's funny to me, and it's something that I'm challenged daily with my own father, even because there's this idea that if you challenge the system, if you are critical of our policies, our laws, our politicians, our government, any sort of specific aspects about our country, then yeah, you're deemed as unpatriotic. You don't love your country, if you hate this country. And it's so ironic to me, because it seems like the people that are the most passionate about being critical of our government are the ones that want to see our nation be a better nation. So that's kind of, well, and that's why I have a personal problem with radical. If anything, I think it's funny that we negatively label people who want change or people who want to better things, but we don't label people who just don't care, or just want things to stay as they are. I call them apathists.
Apathists.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I just think people fear the things in the planes, and then some of the things that Mecha upholds, and not just Mecha, but the whole Chicano movement, and then within the, outside of the Chicano movement, any like large social movements, because people fear change, and I don't know.
Change is always scary, but it's inevitable. It's kind of like gravity or whatever, like glaciers, whether
Right.
it's glacial pace or lightning pace. Yeah, change. So, all right,
So I left Boulder
you left Boulder.
after a year of that. Even though I found Mecha, I found some great things that got me interested in activism, but I left Boulder with my best friend, and we transferred into the University of Oregon for the school year of 2005-2006.
Go West Ventura.
So yeah, I guess I am always I always end up on the West Coast. So, and
how did you? Okay, so much has been made of the social climate, the parallels between Eugene and Boulder. You know, usually the characterization is on the liberal side, right? But I think there are also some connections on the conservative side. So you identified the racism of Boulder, and how did that compare to your experience here?
Oregon was, well, when I first transferred here, I thought, this is great. There's barely any racism. The climate, seems good for everyone, sort of thing. But then I started to notice a lot of underlying racisms, or I guess you'd call them covert racisms, in terms of policies or not even laws necessarily, but yeah, I mean, ballot measures and so forth that were really indirectly impacting underrepresented groups in the state, but doing it in very indirect ways. So on a very small scale, I remember my first year here, the Black Student Union at the University of Oregon had their annual BSU ball and had it at the Vets Club over here
On
in Eugene.
Willamette.
Yeah, on Willamette. I think I was trying to remember what street. And after
I can immediately think of some problems with that, but all right, go ahead.
afterwards, the Vets Club made a policy that anyone who rented out the space, even though they were, paying customers or what have you, could no longer play hip hop music.
Oh, of course.
So it was under the guise of like, well, no, it's
Not even Eminem? Not even Vanilla Ice?
It's not, it has nothing to do with the fact that it's just a coincidence that it's very cultural to the Black community. It's just because hip hop music is loud and rowdy and it tends to cause people to fight. I don't know where they got that, but
Country music doesn't?
So it was hard. Well, I think it's actually a harder fight in Oregon because not only do you have to fight these policies and regulations and laws and so forth that are very racist in terms of what groups they're specifically targeting or affecting, but you also have to take the step further and explain and educate the people as to why that's wrong. And in states like Colorado, it's not as, well, it didn't seem anyway for the year I was there that it was as difficult to explain why certain things are wrong because they were out there, they were in your face, People were showing up to parties in blackface and people were yelling the N-word and spitting on students on campus and
They do that here.
graffitiing in the schools. And not to say that it doesn't happen here, but it was easier to pinpoint them as why they were wrong, and it's harder to say this is wrong, this is racist, because that word scares folks. And there's this assumption that if a policy or something is specifically racist, then that means those people are racist and they're bad. And so there's like this also, people don't understand the difference between something that's institutional racist and people who are racist,
So how did your talk in James's class go?
I thought it went really well. You never know.
Explain the context for the folks today. It was today, right?
It was Monday.
Monday, okay.
Yeah. Well, James is teaching in contemporary Native issues class, so that means that he's going to be talking about a lot of both historical and recent policies that are in effect that have caused the Native people to have to struggle on a much larger level because of being displaced and assimilation and forced into boarding schools, et cetera, right? Even reservations, et cetera. My fear was sort of what I was just talking about, where people weren't going to be able to understand why those things were racist because they would automatically assume that it means our government or our politicians or us ourselves are racist people. Not to say that it's not okay to
call that if it exists.
Right, thank you. But I mean, I think it's also really important that you have to understand the different kinds of oppressions, the different kind of racism there are, so that people, one, feel very comfortable being able to say this is racist and this is problematic and I understand why. But two, so that we have sort of a shared language, you know, so it wouldn't, you know, it would be easier for the class to understand what they're learning on a larger context than just Native issues, but what it means on a nationwide scale, on a global scale, on a historical perspective. So I talked about the 4 different kinds of racisms, and then I sort of went into the types that you and I had talked about earlier. So within those 4, what are the 6 types of individual and institutional racism? So
yeah, name those 4, if you would.
Yes, so individual racism, so person to person, which is commonly a lot of people, I feel like, understand racism as. But then there's institutional racism, so when we talk about specific laws or policies that either directly or indirectly, or even, as you and I were talking about, a lack of policy completely. But then there's intrapersonal racism, so not only between communities of color, but also between institutions. So there's racism within housing, there's racism within transportation system, and there's racism within the employment industry. So interpersonal racism would also be how those interact with each other, because nothing can really be isolated, right? So specifically from my experiences living outside of Los Angeles, the problem with the funding and the way that poor people of color are specifically impacted by low funding of transportation and the bus systems completely interacts and intersects with why they're not able to hold on to good jobs if their buses are continually late, or they just get shut down, or the prices go up and they can't afford them, et cetera. So, which also intersects with if they want to
can't afford a car.
Well, and if they want to get a better job, then they need to go to school, but the same problems that they have are there. And if the better jobs are in the Santa Monica, Beverly Hills area, Pacific Palisades, but the only schools that they can really afford are in the East LA, Compton, Inglewood area. So if they rely on public transportation, and it takes them 4 to 5 hours just to get to one class, to get to school, or to get to their job, it makes it really difficult to either have more than one job or to even take multiple classes. So here in Eugene, taking 5 classes a term is nothing, but that would be impossible if you're also trying to juggle jobs and school, you know, in really spread out areas with very poor public transportation.
To give that a kind of a local spin, because I'm from there, so it would be like you have a job in Eugene, but the only school that you can afford to go to is in Marcola or Walton or Florence. And so you have to, you know, the bus system, if it exists, you know, I mean, so there isn't really a bus system that goes from Eugene to Florence, other than Greyhound. Right. So if the schedule doesn't happen, you know, within your work schedule, then you're out of luck. I mean, there might be buses that go to Marcola or Lowell, for example, but you know, they're not frequent enough to, you know, run a job or go to school or whatever.
Right. So yeah, so interpersonal racism sort of talks about how institutions play out within an even larger scale. And I mean, you can intersect all of them, and then, you know, going into the agriculture business, and then going that into like so forth and so forth. So I mean, it can get global, you know, but everything, looking at things sort of like a spider web, you know, everything is interconnected. So, and then the 4th one is internal racism. So we see images of what the rest of the media or rest of society sees us as, and we internalize that, and we hate ourselves for that, you know, and that plays out on so many different levels, not just insecurities in general, but also just feeling like I'm not going to go anywhere in life. Everywhere I see everyone who's black is a gang member and doing drugs or in their jail, and if that's what they see me as, I'm not going to. Well, that's, you know what I mean? If that's what they see me as, and I guess that's all I'm ever going to be, you know? So and I think that one gets overlooked a lot, like greatly, you know? I think that's sort of where the old myth of pull yourself up by your bootstraps hits the wall, because it's It's not even just about not even about the access, but also about whether you believe in yourself.
Right.
And if the rest of society continually tells you that you shouldn't.
Yeah. That actually makes a good segue. So, because we could have a wide-ranging discussion. Go to slide, if you would. So, you were talking about 4, and we had discussed, the construct that I use in terms of looking at 6. And so, today in class, I used the definition from the guy who actually coined the term sociostructural violence, Dr. Bulhan. So, Hussein Abdullahi Bulhan, from his book Franz Fanon and the Psychology of Oppression. So, the fact that the 4th type of racism, for example, is internalized. Right? So, sociostructural violence. So, Bulhan basically says violence is any relation, process, or condition by which an individual or group violates the physical, social, and/or psychological integrity of another person or group. From this perspective, violence inhibits human growth, negates inherent potential, limits productive living, and causes death, and also disease in this context too. So, yeah, how do you pull yourself up with your own bootstraps if A, you don't have boots, or even if you do have boots, which are all structurally determined, right? Then how do you pull yourself up by them if it wouldn't even occur to you if your place is lowered and you internalize that, well, I can't really get anywhere. I'm going to be whatever the term is. So in the context of my class, we were talking about, okay, where did you get the name poor white trash or redneck? Because black folks didn't give you that name. We may call it, but we didn't give it to you. So who gave that to you? How is it? Somebody asked, well, what does well-heeled mean? Yeah, okay. Yeah, well-heeled means you either buy new shoes or you can repair the shoes that you have. And if you don't, you're down at the heels. Well-heeled, right? The proposed definition, back to slide if you would, rests on several assumptions. First, violence is not simply an isolated physical act or a discrete random event. It is a relation, process, and condition undermining, exploiting, and curtailing the well-being of the victim. Second, these violations are not simply moral and ethical, but also physical, social, and/or psychological. They involve demonstrable assault on or injury of and damage to the victim. I actually prefer target to victim, but it's his language. Third, violence in any of the 3 domains, physical, social, or psychological, has significant repercussions in the other 2 domains. Fourth, violence occurs not only between individuals, as you pointed out, but also between groups and societies. Fifth, intention is less critical than consequence in most forms of violence. So it doesn't really matter whether you intended to do, you have to look at the actual effect. Any relation, process, or condition imposed by someone that injures the health and well-being of others is by definition violent. So with privilege systems, the original intent or design is less important than the effect or the consequences of the fact that the privilege system itself exists and access is not granted to all. So in the context of educational equity, all right, let's talk about that for a minute. So what do you understand that to be, equity?
Well, I particularly like the word equity beyond equality because, for instance, when you think of equality, you might say, well, everyone's equal, and, I look in an institution and I see, brown faces and white faces, and I see women, and I see men, and I see straight people, and I see LGBTQ, so it's equal. There's equal representation. But really, things aren't really equal, or I guess aren't equitable because
some are equaler than others.
Well, because of the access to get into those places, or even like a broader example of employment. So right now we supposedly have equal employment in this country where anybody, regardless of sexual orientation, ethnicity, nationality, gender, etc., has equal opportunity to jobs. So somehow we have equal opportunity in this country. But when you look at the statistics, men are still making more than women. white people are still making more than people of color.
Mm-hmm.
Straight people and people who identify as the gender norms still get more jobs than people who identify as trans or genderless or genderqueer, et cetera. And all the people who seem to run our major media and are the CEOs of multinational, multi-billion, trillion-dollar corporations all
Well,
seem
you
to
can't
look
have a free press unless you own the press, of course.
all seem to look the same. So
Yeah.
is it equal opportunity or equal representation? Maybe. Is it equitable? No.
Yeah.
Of course not. So when in terms of education, I mean, you might have representation for many different kinds of people in college, but are they representative of the demographics in the state or even in the nation? No.
No.
So.
I mean, that's one of the issues we were talking about, or we will be talking about in terms of looking at affirmative action issues because it's under attack, as if, there already aren't affirmative action like in the GI Bill, which benefited white veterans, affirmative action hiring, which benefits white women, et cetera, et cetera. When we're talking about school admissions, I mean, so your parents just paid your way, right? Colorado might have been able to count you, in terms of, look at our numbers, we're equitable or whatever. But one of the things that I pointed out in terms of affirmative action and admissions to schools, the most effective affirmative action programs have never, ever increased the minority population of a school more than 10%, ever. And when we're talking about where it even approached 10%, so minorities are more than 10% in the population collectively.
Well, right.
Right? So we're talking about that university, the law school in Michigan, where the law school itself, the total admission was 300. So 1 year they let in 30 black folks.
Wow.
1 year. That's it. And then it dropped way off then. So, and that was the most ever in history. So affirmative action programs, have never then, in terms of admissions, have never even approached 10% of a total. And then only, in that 10%, of course, is in a limited 10%.
Right.
A limited context, 30 folks. Yeah, okay, great. We're really in danger of taking over, folks, sure. That's
right.
happening. Right. Aslan's going to take over, kick y'all out of Colorado. Sure, that'll happen.
Yeah, and I mean, well, because you mentioned Aslan, that's funny. Because, I mean, really, so right now, and I was telling you this earlier, right now in the state of Oregon, it's possible to have been born here and raised here, gone to being educated here in the state of Oregon, graduated from Oregon High School, and still have to pay out-of-state tuition or international rates if your parents are undocumented. And I mean, I think sometimes it gets turned into an immigration issue or even a Latino issue, which is funny because we have such large populations of Vietnamese and Russians here in the state. But just in general, I mean, it's really
Does that happen for them, though, too? And there's a reason why I asked that.
Yeah, I mean, the OUS system has a documentation status policy for anyone, and everyone who applies to an OUS school, which is the Oregon University system, so any public university in the state of Oregon that is in a community college has to put their documentation status or the documentation status of their parents.
Okay. So help me understand this. Think not less of me and my ignorance. If you're born here, you're a citizen.
Yes.
But if your parents weren't born here and are undocumented, that's where the problem comes in? You get charged out-of-state tuition in that circumstance?
Yes.
Even though you're a citizen?
I mean, both. It's for students who were brought here, right? I mean, when you're a child,
okay.
right? I didn't choose to go to DC or to move to California when I was 7, but So it's for children who are brought here, but it's also, yes, for children who are born here and are U.S. citizens.
Yeah, but your father was working for Reagan and Bush, so theoretically he's a citizen.
Well, and even if they weren't, anyone foreign born but adopted by at least one citizen parent is also a citizen.
Yeah.
But, you know, let's say, you know, my parents, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, you know, even looking at access in terms of policies and laws, I mean, that's a law in the state of, you know, state of Oregon that where people are putting, you know, power behind to try and change, to open the doors of access to higher education for all students, you know, in the state of Oregon. And the DREAM Act seeks to do the same thing across the nation. But, and 10 states do have tuition equity. They do allow undocumented students.
So it's not unprecedented, really?
No, and some of the, well, California and Washington are among them, but also some states that people deem surprising, like Texas and New Mexico, Utah, Oklahoma. Those are all states.
Texas has education.
Has had tuition equity for years. Allows all undocumented students to get in-state tuition.
Okay.
So
they can see the income stream. I don't think it's about educational justice for them, but okay.
I mean, and
Makes
I think,
sense.
well, right, and I mean, I definitely think in a recession right now, why not?
Yeah.
Why not put as many Oregonians to get their degree and into the workforce as possible?
Hello.
But right, I mean, I think in terms of, you know, being a legislative issue, it is about coming out of this recession, you know, with skilled workers and with Oregonians who have their degrees and are well educated and have the ability to take whatever jobs they want and really push our state forward.
Yeah.
But right, I mean, on
who do you think is going to bring you out of the recession? Who do you think is going to be funding your Social Security?
I mean, I know Obama ran on the platform of change, but I think it was more to start mobilizing the American people to start doing things like this. And I think people rely on Obama to make this change, but really it starts with us.
It's still us. It's about us.
Right. I mean, it was empowering and inspiring in the whole elections period, and even, you know, during the inauguration and afterwards was just this really great feeling of excitement all around the U.S. And it was great, but I want people to use that excitement to start mobilizing themselves and making some changes that move us from a state of equality to equity, you know, and not just a state, I mean literally like as a people, as a nation, as a country, moving us towards equity.
Yeah, and I mean, if you want to explore that, the difference between equality and equity. So equality is like a number. You know, when you have an equal opportunity, that means you have the same numeric chance. You submit your application like anybody else. You have the same chance. But then there's like barriers that are invisible.
Well, right. And I mean, like, well, for one, just getting into college, I mean, look at the things that you need to get into college. They want you to have extracurricular activities. They look at your GPA and they look at your SAT scores just to skim the surface. If you go to a poor school, you don't have extracurricular activities.
Right.
My school, one of the schools I went to some very nice schools, but one of the schools I went to couldn't afford to have things like sports and band.
Right.
So right off the bat, a student who has a school that offers more of those things is going to have more on their application. So when you're looking at college applications and one person doesn't have any, or maybe has one and one has a lot, it's deemed as this person wasn't active and doesn't have good moral standing or so forth, or isn't well-rounded. But also, if your family's low income and you have to take one or two jobs through high school, extracurricular activities are a luxury that you cannot afford.
Right.
So then looking at your GPA, nicer schools offer AP classes, offer free tutoring at their school, and you know, have more access to better technology and better textbooks where lower income schools don't. So that reflects on your GPA, even if you're an extremely hard worker.
Right.
And then thirdly, looking at SAT scores, so what schools have SAT tutoring at their schools or can offer it. And even things like Sylvan Learning and Princeton Review are $1,000. I mean, and not to say that they don't offer some scholarships, but I mean, anything over $20 or $30 for some families is a lot for SAT tutoring, not to mention that you have to pay $40 or $50 every time you take the SAT.
Right.
So,
I mean, and the SAT really is also about exposure to content rather than relative intelligence. So I mean,
Right.
I scored 1100 on it, but the people right next to me scored a cumulative 400, and they were
Right.
amazed that I'd scored 11. Like, it's just about reading.
And
me,
for in our days it was out of 1600. It's out
Yeah.
of 2400 now, I
Yeah.
believe. So, yeah. So I mean, when we talk about accessibility, I think people on the surface are like, everyone has access to school. That's not fair to say we don't have accessibility. But when we really look at what it takes to get into college and what kinds of things, what resources you actually have access to in your high schools, yeah, I mean, we don't have fair access. And I mean, another thing is that it's harder to get into college now, and less people are going to college now than our parents' generation. And on the World View, the U.S. is ranked 134th for government prioritization of education.
Ouch.
We are tied with Nigeria in the world.
Oh.
And that is a recent statistic. And not just that, but even looking at the state of Oregon, we're ranked 44th in the nation for government per student appropriation of money. So 43 other states in our nation are funding their students better than us. And then on top of that, 142 other countries are prioritizing education more than ours.
So as part of your work in terms of being a campus organizer, how do those, I mean, you're citing these statistics and that plays into it. So what is it you do in that context then?
What do I do in terms of education?
To change those kind of things.
Okay.
I mean, making people aware is one
Right,
part of it.
right. So education.
I saw you on television, your other television appearance. What was that about?
Was that for the rally?
Yeah.
That was a rally around tuition equity and DREAM
Okay.
Act, but it was also around, that DREAM Act and tuition equity were a part of the rally. The rally was for, comprehensive immigration reform that treats all peoples that come into this country in a fair and humane way and allows safe pathways to citizenship. And it's been proven that raids and displacement and things like Operation Gatekeeper are only causing death and struggle and despair and people to lose their families. Babies are being deported, and oftentimes, even here in the state of Oregon, a friend of mine was a social worker up in Portland, and if they couldn't find family members in other countries to deport the babies to, they would just put them right into foster care. And sometimes here in Portland.
In the other countries?
No, like here in the state. I mean, literally, your
Oh.
baby could be given away a couple blocks down and you'll never be able to see it again because you're undocumented. So just those types of things were just horrible.
Yeah.
And they're not working. So the rally was around comprehensive immigration reform, which included opening the doors of higher education to all students, and all people. But, beyond that, my job, I work for the Oregon Student Association, and we are student-run and student-led. So we have 3 boards, all students from various schools across the state. And they meet once a month and decide what campaigns we're leading, how we're going to set goals to mobilize and organize students across the state. And we lead grassroots campaigns, but we also do a lot of lobbying as well. So students get a chance to not only run grassroots campaigns on campuses, but they also get a chance to go up and meet legislators and lobby and go to rallies and testify at hearings, or even just to be a part of it without necessarily being involved. So sitting in on hearings or so forth. So organizing lobby days if they are not lobbying themselves. And I really enjoy it. So the campaigns they're running this year, besides things like tuition and funding and the Oregon Opportunity Grant, are helping to fund the Student Parent Child Care Grant at a little over $1 million more because there's so many people on the waiting list. They are running
For childcare.
Yes.
Yeah.
They are running tuition equity and research on the achievement gap, and a safer schools policy as well that would strengthen the anti-bullying law that we have in Oregon. That it's not actually a mandatory law. It's just encourages schools K through 12 to adopt a policy that protects victims of bullying. So they're just seeking to strengthen that already. So those are the 6
So
campaigns.
that's K-12 and not just college, is your...
It wouldn't affect post-secondary education at the moment.
Okay.
It's not to say that the students don't find it extremely important. It's just that having to understand taking baby steps at the moment. So we got the anti-bullying law in place, even though we had to pass a watered-down version. So now it's about strengthening that, and then the next step would be, where else can we put this out? And not even just school, right? Not even just the education system, but like what kinds of protections and policies do we have in the workforce and within the food industry and the housing industry, et cetera. So those are the campaigns they're running. The campus organizer here at Lane has been around for about 6 years, I guess now 7. And I help the students run their campaigns. So when they want to go into classrooms and talk to students, I'll help set those up for them and make their copies. And I mean, I do a lot of little work because I think it's important that students feel empowered in what they're doing. But I also recognize that as students, they have classes and jobs and sometimes families and children. So
you graduated already, right?
I did. I graduated last June.
Congrats.
Thank
With
you.
a soc degree?
Yes. Yes, sociology. It's vague and broad. But
Well, it kind of shows in terms of the issues that you're working on, in terms of, being able to define equity versus equality and all the other issues that you're talking about.
I loved it. I loved sociology because of that. A lot of my friends did ethnic studies and tried to convince me to go into ethnic studies because of some of the work I was doing around race relations. But what I loved about sociology is that it connected on other broad bases as well. So like I was saying earlier, I took a class on the sociology of education. And I wasn't really sure what it would be about, but I wanted to learn. And it turns out it was talking about the militarization of schools and the privatization of schools and the curriculum, like who sends us our textbooks, I mean, I had no idea that million-dollar companies sent free textbooks and videos to schools with their names on them and very covertly, as we were saying earlier, making themselves look better than some of the work that they were actually doing by exploiting labor in other countries, so forth. So I was able to learn things that weren't necessarily seen as ethnic studies, but connected on such broad levels. The sociology of environment, same thing. I kind of took it thinking, I don't know what this is going to be about. I'm just going to be learning about the earth. And it turns out it was ingenious. It was amazing. I didn't know that we own the rights to Bolivia's water. They can't even collect rainwater.
Well, that was Bechtel, and I think that got turned around with Morales somewhat.
Right, but it's just so interesting to know that that stuff even happened, or like right now.
How does an American corporation own Bolivia's rainwater?
And also for the first time in the past few years, we've been able to patent genetic materials.
Yeah, right.
Poor indigenous farmers in Central America are getting sued by billion-dollar companies in the U.S. if any of our seeds blow into their farms and it grows, or even if they didn't know. I mean, how many farmers in Central America know what seeds the U.S. owns? But so it's just
even owning seeds.
Right, being able to own genetic materials, it's crazy.
So, right, again, I mean, so when we talk about, the whole concept of Turtle Island, like, okay, no borders, educational equity, you want to learn, great. Come and demonstrate respect and sit down as a student. You want to be a citizen, great. Contribute to the health of our nation. We welcome you. But, things are a little different now.
Yes.
Than it was back in the day.
So I liked it because I was learning other things, but there was race relations mixed in with that and everything intersected.
So, final thoughts?
Final thoughts. I don't know. I guess my final thoughts would just be that I'm not done yet learning. I like the idea that I'm continually being critical about, what's happening around us, being critical of the things we hear from our media, being critical of the language we use and what people say when they say we're in post-racial era or we've turned to colorblind racism now.
Right.
I don't see color. As Colbert says, are you black? I can't tell. I don't see color.
That's good. That's great. a friend of mine, Damali Ayo, does this thing about Rent a Negro, but also one of her latest websites talking about that is, okay, we're in post-racial America. It's Obamistan. So, you know, what is America? Obamistan is the country without racism. You know, tell us what your new life is like.
Yeah. So I don't know. I just enjoy being able to sort of, you know, think critically and have discussions with people about what this means, why that means, and you know, policies that are happening, and really trying to understand things on other levels. So
keep up the good work.
Yeah.
Become a doctor. Teach.
Well, thanks for having me today.
Yes, it was good having you here. If you've liked what you've seen, email us at liveclass@lanecc.edu. Include DiversiTV in the subject line. And let us know what you'd like to see in future shows, because we're always trying to develop the show in terms of getting feedback from our viewers. And go well, stay well.